The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Rosalind had always thought, the cruelest day of the week to receive bad news. Not Monday, when you were still numb from the weekend's end. Not Friday, when there was at least the mercy of 2 days ahead in which to fall apart privately. Tuesday meant you had to get up on Wednesday and carry on, as though nothing had shifted beneath your feet. She read it twice, standing in the hallway of the boarding house on Bleecker Street in Montreal, still wearing her coat. The solicitor's letterhead was embossed in black. The language was precise and unfeeling, as solicitor's language tended to be. The estate of Aldenmore, being the principal property of the late Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, has passed by entailment to his nephew, Mr. Cornelius Hartwell, in the absence of a male heir. The personal effects of the late Sir Geoffrey's daughter, Miss Rosalind Hartwell, may be collected within 30 days of the date of this correspondence. Any claim to the estate or its contents beyond personal effects will not be recognized under the terms of the entailment. Her father had been dead for 3 weeks. She had not been permitted to attend the funeral. That was Cornelius's doing. She knew it without needing proof. The telegram informing her of her father's passing had arrived 4 days after the burial, which was not an accident. Cornelius Hartwell did not make accidents. He made arrangements. She folded the letter along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket, and then she stood very still in the hallway for a moment longer, listening to the sounds of the boarding house around her. A door closing on the floor above, the landlady's kettle beginning to scream in the back kitchen, the muffled conversation of 2 men on the street outside, ordinary sounds, the world continuing without her permission. Aldenmore was hers. She had grown up in its corridors and learned her letters in its library, and buried her mother in its churchyard. Her father had told her so, clearly and more than once. The house will be yours, Rosalind. I will see to it. He had meant to rewrite the entailment. He had been meaning to for 20 years. He had not done it. And now Cornelius Hartwell, who had visited Aldenmore exactly 4 times in Rosalind's memory, and who had once referred to the estate's tenant farmers as a nuisance one simply inherits, was the legal owner of her home. The letter gave her 30 days to collect her personal effects. She had, by her count, 27 days left. She had not planned it carefully. That was what she told herself afterward, that it was impulse or desperation or the particular recklessness that sets in when a person has nothing left to lose. But the truth was that she had been planning it for 3 weeks. In the quiet hours between taking in alterations at the tailor's shop where she worked and lying awake in her narrow boarding house bed. She had simply not admitted to herself that she was doing it. The plan was not complicated. Aldenmore's housekeeper, Mrs. Grenville, had retired the previous autumn. Rosalind knew this because her father had written to her about it. One of his careful, twice-monthly letters that always mentioned the household staff and the state of the south fields and the progress of the kitchen garden, as though he were writing a report to someone who might one day need to manage the place. Mrs. Grenville has given her notice, he had written. I find I must hire a replacement. I confess I am not certain how to go about it without your mother. He had hired a temporary housekeeper named Mrs. Dace, according to the letter that followed, but Rosalind did not know whether Mrs. Dace had stayed on under Cornelius's ownership or departed with the change of household. What she knew was this: Cornelius Hartwell had not spent a night at Aldenmore in 11 years. He would not know the face of every servant who had ever worked there. He would certainly not know the face of the housekeeper, if there was a new one. She wrote the letter of application using the name Rosalind Ward. Ward had been her mother's maiden name before her mother became Lady Hartwell, which Rosalind felt made it hers in some sense that the law could not touch. She addressed the letter to the estate's solicitors, as the advertisement in the Halifax paper had directed, and listed her references carefully. The references were real. She had worked for 2 years as a lady's companion in Halifax before coming to Montreal, and before that she had managed her father's household for the 3 years following her mother's death, when Sir Geoffrey had been too deep in grief to trouble himself with domestic administration. She did not mention that she had managed the household at Aldenmore specifically. She said only that she had extensive experience in the management of a country estate of considerable size. It was not a lie. It was simply a truth that arrived without its context. The reply came back in 10 days. She had been offered the position. She gave her notice at the tailor's shop that same afternoon. Aldenmore looked smaller than she remembered, which she knew was not possible. The stone of the north wing had darkened with the winter, and the elms along the drive had been trimmed back. Improperly, she noticed. The gardener had taken too much from the east side, and the trees would grow lopsided now. The gravel needed raking. The shutters on the upper floor of the east wing were closed, which meant those rooms hadn't been opened since autumn. Rosalind stood at the gate with her traveling bag and her trunk, and looked at her house and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite fury. It was closer to recognition, like seeing a person you love wearing someone else's coat. The footman who met her at the gate was new, young, no more than 20, with a wary look that suggested he was not entirely certain of his footing in the changed household. He introduced himself as Thomas, and she filed this away. Thomas. New. Uncertain. Useful information. He carried her trunk to the house without being asked, which she noted in his favor. The butler met her in the entrance hall. His name was Wentworth, and he had been at Aldenmore for 14 years, which meant he had known her since she was a child of 6. She had been braced for this, had rehearsed it, lying awake in the boarding house. But even rehearsal had not quite prepared her. For the moment his eyes moved across her face with polite professional assessment and found nothing familiar there. She was wearing different clothes than she had owned as a girl. Her hair was different. She was 28 years old, not 12. 14 years was a long time. He did not know her. "Miss Ward," he said, "we have been expecting you. I am Wentworth. The household is at your disposal." "Thank you, Wentworth," she said, and her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. He showed her to the housekeeper's room, which was off the back corridor near the kitchen, a small square room with a single window overlooking the kitchen garden. She had never been in this room in her life. In her childhood it had belonged to Mrs. Grenville, who had kept it spotlessly orderly and smelling of dried lavender, and who had discouraged the young Rosalind from entering on the grounds that a housekeeper's room was her private domain and not a playroom. The room smelled of must now. The window needed cleaning. The small writing desk in the corner had papers stacked on it without apparent system. "Mrs. Dace left the household records in some disorder," Wentworth said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had opinions he was not prepared to share with a stranger. "I took the liberty of gathering what I could, but the accounts for the autumn quarter are incomplete." "I'll see to it," Rosalind said. She sat down at the desk that evening and went through the papers, and as she worked her way through the household accounts and the staff records and the suppliers' invoices, she felt the particular sensation of a person returning to a language they learned in childhood. Awkward at first, then suddenly, painfully fluent. She knew the butcher in the village. She had been going to his shop with her mother since she was 4. She knew the dairy farmer's name and the arrangement her father had kept with him for the past 30 years. She knew that the south kitchen window let in a draft in winter because the frame had never been properly resealed after the renovation of 1887, and she knew which floor floorboards on the upper landing creaked and which did not, and she knew that the library cataloging system her father had devised was entirely personal to him and had never been written down anywhere. She knew everything about this house except how to stay in it without being found out. She had been at Aldenmore for 11 days before she met the Duke. She had known he was coming. Cornelius Hartwell had sent word through the solicitors. Apparently, he communicated with his own household through intermediaries, which told her something about him. That he would be arriving on the Friday with a guest, a Lord Ashwick, and that the guest rooms in the East Wing were to be prepared. Rosalind had spent 2 days organizing the East Wing rooms and had been rather proud of the result, which was petty of her, she knew, but she had spent 11 days in her own house as a hired servant, which entitled her to some pettiness. Cornelius arrived first. She met him in the entrance hall, which was proper. She had arranged for Wentworth to introduce her, which was both proper and useful, because it meant Cornelius would understand from the first moment that she was an employee and not a supplicant. Cornelius Hartwell was 53 years old and had the look of a man who had been handsome once and was now mostly just large. He had her father's coloring, the pale Hartwell eyes, the sandy hair now gone gray, but nothing of her father's manner. Her father had been a quiet man, a thoughtful man, a man who read history and grew roses, and had a way of listening to a person, as though what they were saying was the most important thing he had heard all week. Cornelius had none of this. He had the look of someone who listened to other people only long enough to determine whether they were worth listening to. He looked at her the way he might look at a new piece of furniture, assessing whether it would do. "Miss Ward," he said, "Wentworth tells me you've put the accounts in order." "I have, sir. The autumn quarter was incomplete. I've reconstructed what I could from the supplier records and corrected the household ledger." "Good." He was already looking past her, toward the stairs. "I want dinner at 8. My guest will arrive by 6. See to it." "Of course, sir." He walked past her. That was all. No further acknowledgement. She stood in the entrance hall and listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and did not allow herself to feel anything about it until she was back in the housekeeper's room with the door closed. She allowed herself to feel it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she washed her face and went to speak with the cook about dinner. The Duke arrived at 5:30 in a carriage that was, Rosalind noted from the upper landing window, considerably better maintained than Cornelius's. She heard him before she saw him. A voice in the entrance hall below, low and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who rarely needed to raise it to be heard. She descended the stairs at the appropriate moment and arrived in the hall to find Wentworth taking the Duke's coat, and the Duke standing with his back to her, looking at the portrait gallery with an expression she could not see. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmore," Wentworth said. The Duke turned. His name was Piers Seaton. She had found this out through the solicitor's correspondence, which she had read thoroughly, because the solicitor's correspondence was part of the household records, and therefore legitimately her concern as housekeeper. He was 37. He had inherited the dukedom at 22 on the death of his father, and had, in the 15 years since, acquired a reputation for being extremely difficult to read, and extremely effective at everything he attempted, which were perhaps related qualities. He owned a great deal of land in 3 counties. He had never been married. None of this had prepared her for the reality of him, which was that he was tall and dark and looked at things directly in a way that most people did not. He looked at her directly now, and she was grateful, quite suddenly, that she had been a servant for 11 days. And had learned how to meet a stranger's eyes with nothing particular in her own. "Miss Ward," he said. Not a question. He had been told her name, "Your Grace." She met his gaze for exactly the right amount of time and then looked away, which was what a housekeeper did. "I hope your journey was comfortable. I've had the East Wing rooms prepared." "Thank you." A pause. "How long have you been at Aldenmore?" An odd question. 11 days, Your Grace." He looked at the portrait gallery again. The gallery contained, among other things, 3 portraits of her ancestors, including a particularly large one of her grandfather that had hung in the same position since before her father was born. "It's a fine house." "It is," she said, and something in her voice must have been wrong, because he looked back at her briefly, with an expression she couldn't parse. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it is." She learned in the days that followed that the Duke of Ravensmore was not what she had expected. She was not certain what she had expected. Cornelius's friends tended toward a particular type. Men who talked about land as an abstraction, who discussed the estates they owned as portfolios rather than places. Men who had never pulled a turnip from the ground they owned or known the name of a tenant farmer's wife. The Duke asked Wentworth the names of the indoor staff on his second morning. He walked the home farm with Cornelius on the 3rd day and came back asking questions about drainage that Rosalind overheard from the kitchen corridor. Specific questions, knowledgeable ones, questions about soil type and field rotation that suggested he had either studied the matter or worked with it directly. On the 4th evening, she was in the library cataloging the books, which she had decided needed doing as a matter of household management, and not at all, because the library was the room in the house she loved most, and she had been wanting an excuse to spend an hour in it. The Duke came in at 9 o'clock with a book under his arm. He stopped when he saw her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'll come back." "Not at all, Your Grace. I was finishing." She began gathering her papers. "Is there a system?" He was looking at the shelves, which had the patient look of something that had not been organized in some time. "For the books." She hesitated. There was. It was the late Sir Geoffrey's own system. He organized by the date he had acquired each volume rather than by subject or author, which makes finding specific books somewhat difficult unless you knew his preferences. The Duke turned to look at her. "You said my." The air went very still. "Your Grace?" "You started to say something. It was my, and then you stopped and said it was the late Sir Geoffrey's." She could hear her own heartbeat. A slip of the tongue. "I was going to say my understanding that it was the late Sir Geoffrey's system." He looked at her for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. Then he turned back to the shelves. "Of course," he said. "A reasonable slip." He took a book from the shelf. She noticed with a start that it was a volume of Wordsworth, which had been her father's particular favorite, and settled into the chair by the fire. She finished gathering her papers and left the library and did not look back. What Cornelius Hartwell wanted with Aldenmore became clear on the 6th day of the Duke's visit. She heard it through the study door, which was not deliberate eavesdropping so much as the natural consequence of a household in which the housekeeper's route to the kitchen passed directly by the study, and in which Cornelius Hartwell spoke at a volume that suggested he had never considered the possibility of thin walls. "The estate is sound," Cornelius was saying. "The land values alone. I know the land values." The Duke's voice quieter. "I had it assessed before I came." A pause. "Then you understand what I'm offering." "I understand what you're asking." Rosalind stood very still in the corridor. "The entailment is clear," Cornelius said. "The estate came to me legally and properly. I need capital, you have capital. The transaction is straightforward." He was going to sell it. Of course he was. Cornelius Hartwell had never wanted a country estate in the north. He had wanted what the estate was worth. He had waited until her father was dead and the inheritance was legally secured. And now he was going to sell Aldenmore to a duke who could afford to pay whatever was asked. She walked to the kitchen. She spoke to the cook about the following day's meals. She went back to the housekeeper's room and sat at the desk and put her hands flat on the papers in front of her and breathed. Her father had not rewritten the entailment. He had been meaning to for 20 years, and he had not done it, and she could not be angry at him for it now, So instead, she sat with the anger and let it be general and directionless. And eventually, it became something quieter and more manageable that she thought might be called grief. She had 21 days left, by her count. Whether she spent them here or somewhere else was beginning to seem less important than she had thought. She told him on a Wednesday morning. She had not planned to. Or rather, she had spent 11 days planning not to, which was not the same thing. It was the portrait gallery that undid her. She was dusting, which was work she had assigned herself because the upper housemaids had been falling behind, and she was working her way along the row of Hartwell portraits, her grandfather, her great-uncle Edmund who had died in the Crimea, her great-grandmother whose name she had been told 100 times and always forgotten, and then her grandfather again in the large portrait near the window, and then, at the end of the row, a small portrait that had not been there before. It was her father, a recent painting. She could tell from the age of the face, the gray in the hair. He was sitting in the library chair with the Wordsworth volume in his lap, and he was not looking at the painter. He was looking at something the painter had not included, something to the left of the frame, and his expression was. She put her hand on the wall to steady herself. "Miss Ward." She turned. The Duke was standing in the doorway of the gallery. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She was not. Yes, I'm sorry. I was distracted." He walked into the gallery. He stopped beside her, looking at the portrait she had been looking at. He was close enough that she could see the faint line of a scar along his jaw that she had not noticed before. "Did you know him?" he asked. "Your Grace?" "Sir Geoffrey, you've been in this house. Did you know the man it belonged to?" She looked at the portrait of her father. He had that expression he used to get when he was thinking about something complicated. Slightly abstracted, slightly sorrowful, with the patience of someone who had learned that most problems resolved themselves if you waited long enough. He had not waited long enough for this one. "Yes," she said. "I knew him. What was he like?" She was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, careful with his people, careful with his land. He knew the name of every tenant on this estate and the name of their children. She paused. He was not a man who moved quickly. He believed that most things could wait until they were done properly. The Duke was watching her. "That was not always a virtue," she added. "No," the Duke said. "I imagine not." She turned and looked at him, and she did not look away when she should have, and his expression had changed into something she could not quite identify. "I am his daughter," she said. The gallery was very quiet. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." She stared at him. "You?" "Wentworth," he said simply. "He has been in this house for 14 years. He recognized you on the second day. He told me on the fourth." She felt the blood leave her face and then come back in a rush. "And you said nothing. I was curious what you intended to do." He paused. "I am still curious." She turned back to her father's portrait. Outside the gallery window, the grounds of Aldenmore stretched toward the south fields, winter gray and familiar, the elm trees lopsided from their improper trimming. "I intended to find some way to stay," she said. "I have not found it yet." "The entailment is binding," he said. "I have had it examined by 3 solicitors. I know Cornelius Hartwell's claim is legal. I know that too." A silence. Then he said, carefully, as though he were choosing each word with the same attention he had given to the estate assessment. "Miss Hartwell, I came to Aldenmore to consider the purchase of an estate. What I have found is somewhat more complicated than an estate." She looked at him. "I am a man who manages complications," he said. "It is, I am told, something of a talent. Your Grace, Cornelius Hartwell wants capital," he said. "I have capital. He wants to sell quickly and without difficulty, and I am in a position to give him both of those things. The transaction can be completed within the month." He paused. "It would result in my ownership of Aldenmore." "I am aware of that," she said, and she was surprised to find that her voice came out level. "What you may not be aware of," he said, "is that an estate of this character typically requires a great deal of local knowledge to manage effectively. Knowledge of the tenants, the land, the household, the particular arrangements that have been in place for some time." Another pause. "I would need someone with that knowledge." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very careful way of saying something." "I am a careful man," he said. "Or I try to be. I find it is usually worth the effort." She looked at her father's portrait, at the expression on his face that she had been looking at all her life, the patience of a man who believed that most things could wait until they were done properly. It was possible, she thought, that there were two kinds of waiting, the kind that let things slip away unresolved, and the kind that held steady until something real came clear. "You would need," she said slowly, "a great deal more than a housekeeper." "I would," he agreed. "The north pasture lease needs renegotiating in March. The kitchen garden wall has a crack in the south corner that will let in frost. The library has no system that anyone who didn't grow up using it can navigate, and there is a tenant in the East Field who has been quietly underreporting his yields for 3 years and needs to be dealt with carefully, because his family has been on this land for 4 generations, and blunt confrontation would do more harm than good." The Duke listened to this with the expression of a man who has been given exactly what he asked for. "Yes," he said, "I would need someone who knew all of that." She looked at him. "I am not," she said, "a man to be managed." Something shifted in his face, and it took her a moment to recognize it as amusement. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you are." The negotiation with Cornelius took 4 days, which Rosalind was not party to and was not expected to be. She went about her work, organized the household accounts for the month, oversaw the repair of the kitchen window frame, spoke to Wentworth about the spring staffing needs, and she did not ask questions. Wentworth, who had known her since she was 6 years old, and had, apparently, known who she was for 16 of the past 23 days, and said nothing to Cornelius, stopped her in the back corridor on the second day of negotiations, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and is not certain he should say it. "Wentworth," she said, "you might have told me." "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I didn't know what was right. I have served this house for 14 years. I know. I am glad," he said carefully, "that it will continue to be served." She looked at him. "You don't know that yet." "No," he said, "but I thought it worth saying in case it turns out to be true." She left him in the corridor and went back to the accounts. Cornelius left on a Thursday, which was also a cruel day for departures, Rosalind thought, though she was not certain whether the cruelty was Cornelius's or simply Thursday's. He did not speak to her when he left. He had not spoken to her much during his time at Aldenmore, which she found she preferred to the alternative. The Duke found her in the kitchen garden that afternoon, assessing the crack in the south wall. She had been pressing her fingers along the mortar to determine how deep it ran, and she was fairly certain it ran deeper than it looked. "Well," he said. "It will need to be repointed before April," she said. "Possibly earlier if we get a hard frost in March." She looked up at him. "The negotiations are concluded?" "They are." He looked at the wall. "You were right about the depth. I looked at it yesterday. You looked at the kitchen garden wall." "I look at everything," he said. "It is usually worth the effort." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the kitchen garden was very quiet around them, with the particular quality of quiet that comes in February when winter is beginning to consider becoming something else. "I cannot be your housekeeper," she said. "I think we both understand that." "I do understand it," he said. "I was thinking of something rather different." She had known this was coming. She had known it in the portrait gallery, or possibly before that, possibly as early as the library, when he had asked her what her father was like and listened to the answer the way her father used to listen, as though it was the most important thing he had heard all week. "I am not in a position to be," she began. "You are in precisely the position you choose to be in," he said. "I have found in my experience that women who are not in any position to refuse tend to refuse most effectively when they have decided to." She looked at the crack in the south wall. "That is a very specific observation. I am a specific man." She pressed her fingers against the mortar again. It crumbled slightly under the pressure, which confirmed what she had already thought. It had been left too long, and fixing it would require more than it would have if someone had attended to it at the right time. But it was fixable. That was the thing about walls. They were usually fixable if you caught them before they came apart completely. "March," she said. "You said you would be back for the lease renegotiation in March. I will be here in March. The crack will need attending to by then." "It will." She stood up and dusted the mortar from her hands. The south field stretched away behind the garden wall, gray and quiet, waiting for spring. "I am not a woman to be managed," she said. "So you've said." His voice was dry and perfectly serious. "I find I am not looking for someone to manage. I find I am looking for someone who already knows how to manage everything in sight and is simply waiting for the arrangement to be made official." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the house. At the back of it, the service entrance and the kitchen windows and the upper floor rooms with their closed shutters that she had been meaning to open for the past 3 weeks. Her father had believed that most things could wait until they were done properly. "Official," she said. "Yes, that is a large word. It is," he agreed. "But then, it is a large house." The afternoon light was falling across the kitchen garden in the particular low way it did in February. Long shadows and pale gold, and somewhere in the home farm a door banged in the wind, and Rosalind Hartwell stood in the garden of her house and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific gravity of a thing returning to where it belonged. She did not say yes immediately. She was, as she had said, not a woman to be managed. But she said it before the light was gone.